When Sergeant Stephen Schap's wife Diane told him that she wanted a divorce, he was upset, but he reluctantly agreed. But then he discovered that she was actually pregnant and he wasn't the father. This enraged him completely because she promised that during their marriage they had been faithful to one another. He was so angry that instead of working through this anger and accepting ultimately that the relationship was over, he took matters into his own hands. This is what happens when jealousy leads to murder. This is the case of Stephen Schap and the brutal murder of his wife's lover. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me. I'm in my Chase merch. If you're new to my channel, my cat's called Chase. This is in fact Chase's head, not literally. That would be like a whole introduction of the McDonald triad in Technicolor. But nonetheless, you wanted Chase merch and we thought we'd do something that was very on trend when it came down to the true crime arena, which is of course, don't fuck with cats. If you want one of these, they have dropped and they are amazing quality. If you want to know the kind of quality, it's 440 GSM, which is an incredible heavy and wonderful quality of hoodie. And of course, they wash well and they're brilliant and we make them all here. I don't actually weave them here, but what I'm saying is we print them here, we design them here, and so on and so forth. And it is a very personal exchange when you buy from us. If you fancy one, get yourselves over and get one. Also, today's case is one that's a little bit older, but I think it has some kind of quandaries in it. It's not just an open and shut case of cold premeditated murder. I genuinely think there are nuances, and I'm not for 1 minute saying that I empathise with any murderer, I don't. But I ultimately think that we have to consider mindset when we're dealing with cases of murder, and the case of Stephen Schap really illustrates this effectively. If you're new to my channel, I release all of my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday, although you are going to be getting some extra drops now and then, because I'm trying to record more content, but crime and consistency will always be clear on this channel. You can expect it on a Wednesday and Sunday forever. Literally, till I take my last breath, which I might be doing so whilst recording one of these at some point. Let's get on with today's case. So who was Stephen Schap? So he was born into a very tight-knit Catholic family. He was born in the late 1960s. And when you're growing up in a tight-knit Catholic family, there are expectations that you have of that family unit. For example, you believe that marriage is forever. You're basically brought up to believe that it's a godly thing to do to get married, and it is a godly thing to remain married. In fact, it's considered a sin to divorce, and the Catholic Church itself has been very, very much against divorce. I appreciate that there has been a modernisation of both the Catholic and Christian Church, or at least the Protestant and Catholic area of the Christianity, but nonetheless, it is still frowned upon even today. And certainly when it comes down to divorce in the 1960s, it's going to be challenging for a family who are Catholic to endure a breakup. And unfortunately, that is what happens to Stephen's parents. And they go through a relatively nasty divorce, and he's 14 years of age at the time. We all know that being 14 is challenging enough. Just existing as a 14-year-old in any era is certainly challenging. But when you're going through something that societally goes against convention and also goes against your belief structure, it's going to be psychologically damaging. And also, it's as if when that happens, he feels that he needs to take on the father role. He's the eldest of the children, and he took on apparently a lot of responsibility after his father left. He didn't need to do that. That demonstrates something about the character we're talking about where Stephen Schap is concerned. He saw what his parents had gone through. He really didn't enjoy the fallout and collateral damage of the divorce. And he felt that the only way to counter that was to really engage with the belief that marriage is for life. And he ultimately wanted his marriage to last for life when it happened. He wanted to ensure that if he had children, for example, they weren't going to experience the horrible divorce like he had gone through. He was liked when he was growing up. He was considered a very polite individual, a kind individual. He was very intelligent. He was considered to be gifted and talented. In school, he was actually awarded Student of the Year in his senior year. He went on to study English and psychology at Loyola College in Baltimore. And then after he left education, he worked for the family business in his father's construction company. So he's got a really good thing going on an academic level. He's popular with his peers. His family love him, albeit they've broken down to some degree as far as parents separating, but nonetheless, he's still ultimately working for his father's company, which means that the relationships would be positive there. So even though there is a level of dysfunction, to all intents and purposes, he's doing well and things are working out for him. Now, in 1989, Schap meets Diane. They're on a flight to Baltimore from London, and she'd been in England visiting her auntie and uncle, but just like Schap, she actually lived in Baltimore. So they have this commonality, and he, as soon as he meets this girl on the flight, tells his family that he had met the most incredible girl. His mum said that he always worshipped the ground that Diane walked on. And like a lot of things when you are young, when you want things to happen quickly, things move fast. They apparently fell very hard, very fast in love. And people said from the outside looking in, they were really happy. But this meant that even weeks into the relationship, he's at a point where he wants to propose. And he does. Weeks into it, just weeks. And that's a very impetuous nature, particularly in light of the fact that Stephen Schap wants his relationship to work. He wants to get married, he wants to have a lifelong commitment, and he holds dear to those values. And it kind of goes against the grain to say, well, let's give it a few weeks, and if I like them and say that I'm going to get married to them, it's going to last a lifetime. I mean, we all know that relationships take time to foster an understanding of one another. And you can have a great 3 years with somebody before you even get married and ultimately think you're going to spend your life with that person and be deeply in love at that point. And then 10 years down the line, the relationship breaks down, even though you've had ultimately all of those years getting to know that person. The idea that after a few weeks, your marriage stands a good chance is naive. But then when you're in your early 20s, you're going to be naive, particularly if you haven't had a big reference of relationships, and he hadn't. He meets Diane. She stands out to him. She's significant. She's different for him. There is something about this woman that makes him believe that the possibility of a future with her and a lifetime possibility with her is something that could happen. And he wants to grab hold of that moment and propose to her. But of course, that speaks to all of us listening right now, that is built within the realms of innocence and naivety. You don't know somebody after a few weeks. Hell, you don't know somebody after a few years often. And so you're putting yourself in a negative position as far as the chance for your relationship to work out if you run too fast at the very beginning and make those big life decisions. You might last a lifetime, but you've got time. And ultimately, he's failing to acknowledge that they have that time. And again, that says something about attachment. It's likely the impact of his parents' breakdown relationship-wise has made him feel that he wants to hold on to things that have meaning because he had no control when his parents' relationship broke down. It's a very symptomatic reality for many people psychologically that when they lose something of great value, such as the security of a marriage and their parents, when they are confronted with the potential of holding on to something, it becomes so powerfully important to do so because they know what it's like to lose. And unfortunately, that can lean in to these impetuous decisions where you're just desperate to cling on to something. And the most obvious way in a relationship with a partner is to say, I want to commit to you for the rest of my life. Marriage offers that route. So I think it's a reaction to his parents' loss of relationship that he's so desperate to gain this one and commit to it in a way that is, as far as he's concerned, forever. The idea of being abandoned by her would be too painful to even consider. So after just 6 months after initially meeting her, they get married. Now, as you would imagine, they go down the classic route of thinking about a family, and she gets pregnant, and they are thrilled at this news. But unfortunately, that pregnancy ends in a miscarriage, and they are young. Everything was to play for. They're at a point in time where life is full of possibility and hope, and they found each other and they've got married and now they're pregnant and everything is working to plan, working to type, and then boom. In your young years, in your early 20s, you're faced with this horrific loss of miscarriage, and it's so challenging. And as somebody who has miscarried more times than I care to mention, and many of you know my own journey to have the children that I've got has been splattered with loss. It's as simple as that. When you go through those feelings, a level of maturity doesn't ease those feelings at all. But just because of your experience of life and suffering, as you get older, even though they are horrendous to go through, I have gone through them early and I've gone through them as an older person, and I am more versed in managing difficult emotions as somebody who's got decades behind me, as opposed to when I was young, because I hadn't endured psychologically suffering in the way that I had later down the line. And like I said, that's not to minimize somebody in their 30s having a miscarriage. I'm saying that you are built differently than you are in your early 20s. And this is probably the first moment that they're realizing that what they think they're creating on a perfect level is imperfect, because life is imperfect. And they're devastated by this. And then they try again, as you would, and they go through another 2 further miscarriages. Now, after the 3rd miscarriage, Diane is really not wanting to consider another pregnancy. She feels like there is something that needs to be acknowledged and accepted, and also just the issues that she's having to deal with on a psychological, emotional and physical level, because miscarriages are horrible, and she's having to manage this as an individual, because even though your partner is sharing that space with you, it is individual. It's not a we are pregnant, it's a I am pregnant. It's not a we are miscarrying, it's a I am miscarrying. That's the reality for any female who's gone through it. So he wants to be there for her, but the only thing that he can do is to offer his support. And basically, he doesn't want her to go through it again as well, because the emotional toll is enormous and the health toll is enormous. So they start talking about possible options, and she starts to think about maybe having tubal ligation. That means that it would make her sterile, basically. They tie her tubes, essentially. It's a major procedure, and it's not one to be undertaken lightly. Now, Schap doesn't want to have to go through this. He's like, you've been through these miscarriages. You've done this for me and for us, trying to create this family, and I'm going to be here for you now. So instead, he decides he's going to go ahead and get a vasectomy. I think that's a really terrible decision, by the way. I'm going to put that out there now. We're talking about a guy who's 23. No one in their right mind should allow a young man of 23 to have a vasectomy. I don't care what issues are going on. At 23, you know jack all. Sorry if you're 23 and you're watching this. It is not being disrespectful in any way saying it. In fact, quite the contrary. I'm saying at 23, everything is about learning and living. It's beautiful. But you don't know enough at that point to say, I want a vasectomy. Now, apparently that decision was very surprising to people who knew Schap, because he'd always expressed a desire for children. But that says something about him wanting to put his wife's health above his own wishes. And that would be considered quite a noble thing to do. Like I said, it's not the right decision because he's 23, but at the end of the day, he's doing it because he loves his wife. And it is worth noting that I personally have worked with young people who have gone and seen doctors to talk about having vasectomy, not even when they're in relationships, just because they've decided they definitely don't want children. And those doctors have said no, because they feel that that person is far too young to make that decision, and that would be the right thing to do. But this is what happens, and like I said, I don't think they've thought about that clearly, and I don't think that was the right decision on any level, but this is where we are. And then the couple decide that they might look at adoption because they want to create a family, and adoption gives them that opportunity. Now, in 1991, Schap makes a decision that I think was quite surprising to his family. He decides that he wants to join the army as a private. So he did this, and he leaves the family business, which, like I said, would be quite an unusual move, because when you're working in a family business, there's a strong possibility you're going to end up with that family business, and that's probably going to give you a really lovely life. It was reported that the reason that Schap decided that he wanted to change his job was that he wanted to spend more time with Diane. Also, he wished to learn to fly. But it's unusual when you consider that thought process to imagine that that was the reason, because the army is pretty demanding. I mean, it's very time consuming. It's more time consuming on the whole than a regular 9-to-5 job. And you do tend to spend a lot of time away from your family. So why you would think that was going to leverage more time for you and your partner, I'm not sure. But essentially, that was what he was saying was the reason behind it. Although learning to fly a plane, I get that. I mean, if you're passionate about flight and you want to be a pilot, and the army is an opportunity that's going to provide that for you, well, that makes sense. So in 1992, Schap was sent to the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment in Fulda, and he was assigned to the aviation squadron as a helicopter mechanic. So even though he had dreams of flying, he ended up working as a helicopter mechanic. So I guess what we could draw from that is maybe the relationship between him and his wife isn't going as smoothly. Maybe the problems they've encountered with the losses have created some fractures. Maybe working in the family company, because you're expected, of course, to put in as much as you can because it's a family company, has become something that's a little bit stressful, and he doesn't want to have to deal with confronting those issues, maybe telling his father that he wasn't happy. So the army offers a great range of benefits, and it's a good way of maneuvering himself from the family business and dealing hopefully with some of the issues that his relationship had, and starting again with his wife somewhere new. That can be a really attractive proposition when you've been through trauma. One of the things that we say psychologically when we work in therapy with people is if you go through a period of trauma, don't do anything in the first 6 months after encountering it. So you lose somebody you love, don't put your house up for sale. You go through divorce, don't leave your job. It's not because you might not want to do all those things. It's just that often when you're dealing with trauma, you have these knee-jerk reactions where you're like, I just need to change my life, because you want to escape the feelings. And of course, the problem is the feelings go with you. So it could be that this is a reaction to the traumas they've encountered. So Schap relocates to Germany to be in the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment, and he basically goes with Diane. And we can all imagine that they'll be really excited. They've got this new fresh start. They've had all this pain, all these miscarriages, and now there's a completely new life ahead of them. Something quite exotic, isn't there, about traveling to different places and leaving everything you've known and discovering new opportunities. And Schap was apparently an excellent soldier. They said he was really hardworking. In fact, his sergeant commented that he was one of the most professional soldiers he'd ever dealt with, and he did really well. So he ended up becoming a sergeant himself, and that's a position of real respect, and rightfully so. He was somebody who got on really well with his comrades, and he developed one particular close relationship with a man called Gregory Glover. So he was somebody who worked as a helicopter mechanic as well. Gregory Glover, how would I describe him? Well, I will take it from a quote that I found about this particular individual. They said he was a fresh-faced, handsome helicopter crewman from Phoenix. He was described by people who knew him as down-to-earth, as really cheerful, a really all-round good guy. And the two became quite close, so Gregory and Schap would hang out together, they'd exchange CDs, and he would go round to Schap's apartment and go in for conversation or dessert. So obviously he starts getting to know Diane as well. So they start to become friends because he's spending a lot of time at the couple's home. Diane also at this point is doing some voluntary work for the legal office at the base, so she's now got connections with the base as well. Now, unfortunately, not long after the move to Germany, Diane actually became quite restless. She missed home. She's quite lonely. And I think the idea of relocating to a whole new country can feel so exciting. But even if you're surrounded by people who speak English on your base, the truth is, if you don't have German as one of your languages, it can be quite isolating, because on a community level, yes, you can hang out with everybody that you work with, but who wants to do that all the time? I mean, I don't think I ever went to one Christmas do in all the years I worked for organisations. No disrespect to the people I work with, they were lovely. But you know what? I got paid for the hours that I worked, and I really didn't need to spend any time more at work than I actually needed to. So when my free time arrived, I wanted my free time, right? And I guess Diane felt the same. But when you're in a foreign country, it's hard to find people who speak your language, who have your sense of humour, etc., because there's a cultural reality to that as well. So she's really lonely. And then because of that, there's stress in the relationship. Clearly, he's doing very well at work. He's laying down new roots. He's creating friendships and flourishing to some degree. But this mismatch of feeling means that previously happy marriage, well, it starts to go through a rough patch. And again, we have to remember how young these two were when they met and how quickly they got together. So their relationship has gone through quite a lot of trauma. The honeymoon period is, of course, over, because it always ends. You can't be lovesick all the time, you get nothing done. And then you're left with actually what the relationship is like. And for them, there are fractures, and those fractures seem to be getting bigger. And she just doesn't feel the same for Schap as she had. That intense love, it's dissipating, and she's not feeling satisfied in her life. Now we get to September 1993. Schap has to go away for work because he's got to go away training for a few weeks, and this is normal. So he's got a couple of weeks away field training, which means that Diane's going to be in Germany by herself, essentially. And she has some time to think and reflect. And there are things going on that Schap is unaware of in Diane's life. And she's reached a conclusion that she doesn't want to be in the relationship any longer. So when he gets back from this training, she says, I want a divorce. And he is apparently really blindsided. He had not done the maths. Even though he would have clearly known that she was not necessarily totally satisfied, he was all in where this relationship was concerned. He was committed and devoted. He was in it for life. So they might go through some rough periods and rough patches, but they can work on that. And he cannot believe that she is at such a point that not only is she saying there are problems in the relationship, she's saying, I don't want this relationship anymore. Now, he was really heartbroken. He was very shocked. He did express that he wanted to work on the marriage, but she was very clear she didn't want to do that. She said that she'd realised that the relationship was over. I've read some extracts from things that she said in court, and what she gets across in that is that she had been trying to communicate with Schap for a period of time. It's not as if he'd gone away, come back, and there's this whole new chapter arrived without him being actually informed that there are problems. It's more that when she was communicating with him, he wasn't taking it on. And again, we see that with people who've got issues around abandonment, issues around attachment, because they're so terrified of ever being abandoned, of losing something that's important to them. What they will do is when problems arrive and a person starts to talk about it, they just won't hear it, they'll avoid it, they'll distract themselves, they won't take it seriously, they'll try to not engage because it's just too painful ultimately to acknowledge that things are going wrong because it's their deepest fear. So therefore, even when Diane was trying to talk to him about their problems, he was not computing that they were real because it was too painful. So he's avoidant of that. So essentially, even though she has had these conversations, it feels like he's hearing it for the first time when she eventually says, it's over. So the following day after this conversation, Diane actually leaves their home and goes and spends a few days with a friend and also spends a day with Gregory Glover. So we have Schap at home, reeling, shall we say, from the reality that his wife, who he is absolutely in love with, bear that in mind, we're not talking about a man who's in the equal territory where this breakdown is concerned. He loves her, he wants to stay in this marriage, he can't quite compute what's gone wrong, and he doesn't understand it. He's got time, she's not present, what are you going to do? Snoop. And so many of us can be judgmental about that. You know, don't go read somebody else's diary. That's a terrible thing to do. It's a violation of their privacy. That is correct, it is. But if your partner has just landed you with the news that they're going and there's no opportunity for you to work through it and you're like, this feels a little bit left field, I wasn't really expecting this, what has changed? And then you're like, ooh, their diary, the journal of their innermost thoughts. No, I should walk away from the diary of such innermost thoughts, even though I want to know what the innermost thoughts of my partner may be, so that I can understand where they are leaving me. No, it's a terrible thing to do. No, very few people would do that. Most of us have made ourselves a drink, got ourselves some ice cream so we can cry into it, and we're halfway through the journal, reading, trying to figure out what went wrong. I know good people won't do that, but I would not be one of those good people. I may even have invited friends round to do it with me. Just saying, you can't help when there's that information in front of you and you think this could give me some insight and I can learn about why things have broken down. Or if you have some suspicions and you're thinking maybe those suspicions will be realised if I read the information, you are probably going to do that. It's like when people check the partner's phones. You shouldn't. It's an invasion. But at times, you want to because you believe that there is a potential they are playing away, for example. Again, I'm not justifying it. saying I'm a terrible person for being the kind of person who would go and do that. I'd actually look at the journal. I'm saying it is quite human to do these things, and he's got time to do that. So he starts looking through her things, finds the diary, reads it, and he kind of can tell from the indications within it that she's cheated. And this really upsets him. In fact, he rings his father and just says, I'm really upset. I really feel like Diane has been cheating on me. And his father says to him, you have to be strong. Now, clearly, this is going to be festering, and it will be. When you have deep-set suspicions about an individual that you love playing away, breaching the sanctuary and the sanctity of your marriage, and you've had hours to gestate on this, you're going to be ready with a series of questions. And so when Diane arrives home that evening, it's the evening of December the 5th, Stephen is literally waiting for her. And he owns it straight away and says, look, I've done something that I deeply regret. I've read through your diary. And then he just directly asks her, have you been unfaithful? Now, Diane at this point is clearly in a situation where she doesn't want volatility. She doesn't want conflict, but also who wants to get found out? Like, the right thing to do is to say, yes, I'm so sorry. I wish I hadn't done it. I feel terrible. Equally, human beings are very quick to lie to save themselves in certain situations. And it's sometimes an automatic response when you're thinking of protecting yourself because you don't want the truth to come out, to just knee-jerk reaction say, no, you're reading too much into this, and that didn't happen. And that's what Diane does. So she basically tries to assure him that she hasn't had any relationship extramaritally, and she does a reasonable job. She said that he seemed satisfied at that point. And then the following day, they actually went to see the army chaplain to make arrangements for Diane to go home. At this point, Diane was convinced, at least, that they had reached this amicable settlement. And she'd already got plans in her head. She'd moved on. She was actually going to try to seek a job in Baltimore because Gregory Glover was being transferred shortly to Fort Bragg. So they were planning a future, essentially, together. Now, to this point, what is very clear is that Stephen Schap is quite a decent human being. Ultimately, we can never read into the minds and hearts of these human beings, particularly when we're talking about gruesome murder cases. What we can say about Stephen Schap until this point is, when you look at who he's been a hardworking, kind, generous of spirit individual, a person who opens his home to friends, who has really solidly supported his wife, who is clearly having a relationship with his mother and father, even though they've broken up, and is trying his best to make good in this world. There are no glaring red flags in the background. We're not like, but do you remember when Stephen Schap actually murdered the puppy? Didn't happen. Remember when Stephen Schap set fire to that cornfield for no reason? Didn't happen. Because he's been a really good guy. And that's why this case ultimately has some nuances for me. Because like I said, other than him snooping through her diary, he's been somebody who is willing to get a vasectomy so that she doesn't deal with any more suffering. Even though we know that he wanted children desperately, he'd also accepted that she wanted a divorce, and he wasn't fighting too hard once he realised that she felt that way. He was respecting her feelings, even though he believed that marriage was for life and he wanted to work on the relationship instead of throwing in the towel. He was apparently just 100% willing to respect Diane's wishes. But that perception of Stephen Schap that I've just described, this description of a man who's reasonable, who's respectful, wow. Is it going to be shattered by the events that occurred on December the 7th, 1993? So on this fateful day, Diane gets taken into hospital in Fulda. Now bear in mind, Diane knows that this means that her husband is going to be informed of this, even though they're separated. The point is, he is still married to her and it is protocol. So she knows he'll be informed, but she also prompts somebody to inform Gregory if they see him, so that he is also aware that she is in hospital. And At the point where Schap goes to hospital to check on her, he believes that she's bleeding because that's what was happening, and that it was likely that it was an ovarian cyst. And apparently she'd had ovarian cysts in the past and they'd caused a problem, so he was assuming this was the issue. But it isn't. And unfortunately for Schap, when he arrives at hospital, he finds out that she's pregnant. Now, bear in mind what we know about the vasectomy, bear in mind the miscarriages, and then put yourself in this mindset. She's pregnant, and he knows that isn't his baby. So he knows that she may be bleeding, may be miscarrying, but ultimately, he won't be the father. Now, it turns out she wasn't actually having a miscarriage. She just had to remain in hospital for a few days due to complications with the pregnancy. But at that moment of origin, when he walks in, it really doesn't matter whether she keeps the baby or loses the baby. What matters is he bears no relationship with that baby. So he is stunned. And this confirms, of course, those suspicions when he'd read her diary that she'd been cheating on him. So at this point, Diane essentially is stuck. She can't deny it. You know, she's bleeding because she's pregnant and he's aware of it. So she ends up having to confess that indeed she has been having an affair and that the baby has a father who is not him. This must have been an absolute kick in the teeth for him. He'd had a vasectomy for her, despite the fact that he wanted children himself. And there she is, pregnant with another man's child. Now, what's unbelievable to me is that despite this, because we're all probably imagining our reaction, mine would not have been very good. If I'd found out in the situation where I was the male and my partner was basically potentially losing, although she didn't, but potentially losing this child and it wasn't mine, I would have walked out and doubtfully ever spoken to her again. Genuinely, because I have very flexible boundaries, but they snap in the end. And ultimately, if somebody did that to me, and it's happened to me in my marriage, not the one I'm in now, where my husband cheated with a friend of mine, that was it, over. Because there are points where we know we're not willing to even negotiate or navigate. It's over. And everyone obviously deals subjectively in these situations. But again, he reacts, in spite of what I've just said, by asking about her health. Also, he says, oh, I hope you don't lose the baby. So what state is he in that moment? And it intrigues me. Psychologically, what we're seeing there is him swallowing his feelings, his reaction of asking about her health, saying that he hopes what's best for her is that the baby's okay and that he doesn't want her to lose it. He's suppressing reality. He's suppressing how he feels. That's not a normal reaction. It's not a valiant reaction. It's not a heroic reaction. It's a mismatch reaction. He has a right to be angry. He has a right to be hurt. He has a right to feel betrayed. He has a right to feel like the victim of that circumstance. But instead, he plays this position of being a good man, a caring man, putting his own feelings away and protecting hers. And the problem there is feelings find a way forward. If you can't allow yourself to express how you feel, if you swallow it all down, eventually it finds a way to bubble out. And unfortunately, if you don't allow yourself incremental releases, we can often find that individuals who do this kind of emotional swallowing in the end erupt, literally. And those kind of cases are deeply sad because the human being has been trying to be so good, trying to suppress what they need, what they feel, trying to be what everybody else wants. And ultimately, when they lose what they've been so deeply trying to protect, they haven't got the emotional bandwidth to manage. And we see a good human dissolve into pure rage. So we're at a point where he is again in the hospital saying it's all about her. He just hopes that she's okay. And At this point, she obviously has to go into details a little, saying that she's pregnant, saying that she's having the extramarital affair. He says that he appreciates the marriage has failed. He also then at this point says, do you know what? Why don't I go and get you some toiletries and clothes from the house? Again, that is totally left field. You might want to go and get some clothes from the house so you can take them to the nearest incinerator or refuse tip and just dump them all there because you'll never need them again. Or you may never want to go back to that house again because it's going to reflect a piece of pain that you are carrying. So he offers to go and gather some toiletries and clothes from the house, and he even asks Diane, could he be a friend to her in that way? So he's really doing a good job of seeming to take this incredibly well. But like I said, the saying still waters run deep, that is so contextually correct when we're talking about somebody who copes psychologically in this way. It's all okay, I'm a good person, let me just act like a robot. No one acts like that in these scenarios. Now, apparently they agreed at this point that it'd be better for her not to tell him the name of the father because, understandably, she's probably a little bit afraid of what would happen if he finds out that it's his friend, but also it could mean that there'd be some level of retaliation. And again, that would be totally in line with what we'd expect for a male to feel, that somebody has been sleeping with his wife, he's probably going to want to have a row with them. So maybe that's about preventing that getting out of hand. Again, at this point, he doesn't push her too far trying to get a name of the person that's been having the affair with her. He then leaves the hospital because he wants to go and get stuff for her, and he's away for about an hour. Now, apparently, when he gets back to hospital at that point, he's in a different situation. Apparently, he seemed agitated. He said he feels sick to his stomach, which he would. It's that feeling of dread. And anybody who's been in this situation will connect with this. It's like everything that you ever planned has fallen away. The future that you thought you knew, it's just dissolved before your eyes. And you're dealing with this harsh reality of everything that you thought you knew, you no longer know. So totally as we'd expect, feels sick, feels probably a sense of panic. And then he's had some time to ruminate whilst he's been out of the hospital. He's started to think about what the father's rank is. And so she at this point says he's a specialist, which was a lower ranking soldier, and he just can't let it go. Then he starts demanding to know every detail about where they had sex. This is quite contextual. I've worked in relationship therapy many occasions with people who've had affairs, and they, if they're trying to work through the relationship with their partner, want to know in minutiae detail exactly where they'd had sex, exactly how things had played out. And it's almost like filling in the gaps. You need to punish and torture yourself with the information so you get used to it. So this is not unusual. This is not unique. The fact that he's asking her to tell him exactly what happened. He said, did you have sex in the bedroom, in our bed, on the couch? So she ends up telling him that they'd had sex on a quilt in their apartment and on the floor. And he basically says, I don't ever want to live in that apartment anymore. Again, nothing unusual there. You have an aversion to being present in a place where terrible things have happened for your relationship. But he just can't let it go. The pressing of Diane for the information about who she's been having sex with. So when she's told him about the rank in the army, he started to do the maths, and all of a sudden he realizes who it is. He realizes that his wife's lover is his good friend Gregory Glover. Now this is a humiliation on every level. This isn't just his wife leaving him. This isn't just his wife having an affair and being pregnant with another man's child. This is betrayal of one of his close friends. At this point, he leaves the hospital and he tells Diane that he's going back home. But he doesn't go back home. Instead, full of rage, with that festering, bubbling feeling that's been building up, he goes back to the army base with one intention. He wants to find Gregory. Gregory's actually at the point when he arrives at the base, he's in a phone box on the phone to Diane. So just after 5 p.m, she's received a phone call from Gregory because he'd learned at that point that she was in hospital. So whilst Gregory's on the phone, he's very upset, he's very worried, he's worried about Diane, he's worried about their unborn baby, and she's just reassuring him the pregnancy's fine. And it's then that the conversation turns to Stephen Schap. And Gregory says that Schap had actually given him a lift earlier in the day and he'd been talking about his marriage problems. So that's how connected Schap and Gregory were, that Schap is confiding in him. Little does he know in that moment that the man sat next to him in his car is sleeping with his wife and has got her pregnant. Now, Diane and Gregory's conversation was going on for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then suddenly, Gregory swears. Then there's a second expletive, and it's cut off mid-breath. Then all Diane hears is the dial tone. And the reason that her conversation has ended is because the father of her unborn child at this point was being murdered by Schap. So Diane's having this conversation with her lover. That phone call gets cut off because Schap has arrived with a knife, found him in the phone box and started stabbing him. Now, initially, Gregory only suffers a slight knife wound in the telephone booth because obviously it's quite difficult to get in there, but he's desperate to escape because Schap is clearly in a rage, he's armed. So then he tries to run on foot, manages to get a short distance, but then sadly falls. So he trips over. At that point, Stephen Schap's on him and apparently was on top of him immediately, according to witnesses. What we know about Gregory Glover is he was stabbed with a knife 10 to 15 times. This is around his head and neck. And then Schap apparently used the knife to make repeated cuts through Glover's neck, leaving what the pathologist at least called was a very ragged wound. Apparently, the stabs in the head and the neck were so severe, and because there were so many of them, and because it was with an 8-inch army survival knife, his head was almost severed from his body. And then as Gregory's body lay on the ground, Schap then proceeded to repeatedly kick his head until it became detached from his body. Now, there were multiple witnesses who actually saw that happen. Anthony Penny, who was Gregory Glover's roommate, he watched the whole attack. He yelled for someone to call for help. He ran outside and he actually saw Gregory's head roll away. This is when he was violently sick himself. And he said that Schap said to him, he even said he was sorry in this sarcastic voice. So he's telling this witness that whilst Gregory is being murdered, he's saying to Stephen Schap, I'm sorry, because he knows why Schap is doing it, ultimately. He knows the attack is happening because Diane is pregnant and Schap's found out. And he's apologising when this attack is playing out. And we also understand that in a moment where you're getting attacked, you're going to apologise because you're going to hope it's going to stop the attack. But for Schap, it didn't do anything. His rage was so enormous. His anger, his humiliation, his betrayal so overwhelming that he just wants to take every bit of that rage and anger and humiliation out on Gregory. He then held Gregory's head, now detached from his body, up to all of the onlookers and said, "This is what you get for adultery." Then he picked up Gregory's head and ironically placed it into an athletic duffel bag which had head on it. So there's a brand, isn't there, head, and that was a bag that literally had head on it when he put Gregory's head in it. Horrific. And again, what we're seeing in that moment is a man who has lost all sense of reality, aren't we? He's never put a foot wrong in his life. He's always tried his best and it's got him nowhere. So in that moment, all of those realities come into sharp focus. Behaving himself, working hard, being kind, opening his home to friends. It's meant nothing. His wife's pregnant with another man's child, a friend's child. So him being a good person, where's it got him? And that seems to be, as far as I'm concerned, that psychological trigger of, well, I'm not going to be that good person anymore. I'm going to be the bad person. I'm going to cause the pain. I'm going to carry out this attack because Why should I toe the line? It's got me nowhere. And ultimately, like I said, that suppressed rage. It surprises me that during that attack, when you're on a military base, no one intervened. Just throwing it out there, guys. I know it's not their fault. But there's a guy being hacked to death in front of lots of people. Now, just going to throw it out there, you're all military trained, which should suggest that a few of you together could probably get him off. That particular individual is attacking. I'm just throwing it out there. Just might be an idea. You know, you're there, willing to die for your country. Maybe just jump in, grab this crazed man off this very injured individual. But no, you're not going to do that. He's going to watch. He's going to watch, throw up, shout for help. You're not actually going to do anything. You're okay, fine. But that's what happened. Now, I get it. Could have been the element of shock. That might be why they didn't help. Could have been the fact that they knew the attacker as well as the actual victim, and that is blindsiding. And of course, there's also the bystander effect, Kitty Genovese. That's the classic bystander effect that we learnt a lot from, where basically you can get murdered and be screaming for help and people hear and do absolutely nothing. But you would think that people who were in the army would be less likely to follow that psychological route because they're trained to kill and they're certainly trained to protect, and that didn't happen in this case. Now, meanwhile, of course, we have somebody lay in bed completely unaware of what's happening, which is Stephen Schap. She's just wondering what's happened on the phone. She thinks, well, maybe the phone went dead because there was a problem with the actual phone itself. She has no idea of what's unfolding. That is until Stephen Schap walks into her hospital room and says, "Look, Diane, Glover's here. He'll sleep with you every night now. Only you won't sleep because you'll have seen this." And he presented her with her head of her lover. He said, "Don't underestimate me. I'm very skilled at what I do. I studied this, I planned this, I calculated this." He then placed Glover's head on the table, which was next to the bed, and then physically forced Diane to look at it, as she was obviously horrified and trying to look away. And bear in mind, she's in a very vulnerable state. She's dealing with a pregnancy that she desperately wants to keep. She's had some bleeding. She's in hospital, and she's in a situation where now she's under threat. There's a man who's clearly willing to kill because she has the evidence of her lover's head in front of her. She is going to be wanting to avert her eyes immediately. Apparently, he was really agitated at this point, which we'd understand him to be. And she said, in spite of that, everything he said was lucid. She said it was as if he was very present, even though he was quite agitated and beside himself in other areas. He knew what he was doing. He went on to say to her, "You know, you gave me enough clues. It was easy enough to figure out." And he then said, "I did this for you. I love you." Which I'm just going to throw in, probably isn't the most loving thing you could do. You know, I'm struggling with that. No, I did this. I did this for you. When did I ask for you to do that? No, you didn't need to. That's what makes me a really good partner. I did this for you. It was a gift. I'm pretty sure that's my lover's head, my baby's father's head. I'm not sure I ever indicated I would want you to do that. I'm pretty sure, according to every conversation we've had recently, that you know I'm leaving you because I'm in love with someone else. And you've killed that someone else. And now you're saying you did it for me, which kind of means that you're trying to put some responsibility onto me. So I just want to be very clear. I want to be very clear, Stephen Schap. I don't love you. I did love him. And you didn't do this for me. So you can pedal back with that responsibility and accountability zone thing, okay? Just giving it back to you. Anyway, this is what he says in his slightly delusional state, I would say, that this is all for her. But again, we have to bring into context the way he manages his emotions is to swallow it all down, to not hear reality. It's exploded now and confronted with a new reality, he's trying to hold on to the one thing that I think is true, which is that he genuinely does love her and genuinely wishes that they could stay together. Even though it's just smashed to smithereens, there's no going back. There's no hope now for their relationship. It's destroyed. For him, clearing his arch enemy in that moment was his only route to having her back, even though it's so illogical where reality is concerned. Now, of course, Diane is screaming, which you would imagine, and doctors run into the room, and then they see this unbelievable sight of this man's head on the table, and Schap will not let them cover it up, by the way. In fact, he wants her to be looking at that head. He wants her to suffer to some degree. He wants her to know that she has a responsibility level here. It's not just that he's murdered this man because he was in a situation where he'd got his wife pregnant. He's murdered this man and now wants her to have to look at what her actions and their actions have done. So he's bringing her into sharp focus and saying, you look at this, you did this. Because if you hadn't strayed, this man would be alive. So you look into his eyes, because the reason they're dead eyes is because of your actions. And again, that's psychologically very manipulative, very malevolent without a doubt. The doctors are obviously scared initially, but then they realise that he isn't a threat to them. Like I said, one of the doctors tries to cover the head with a towel and he says, no, sit down, leave it that way. And then both of the doctors literally sit in the chairs and talk to him. They talk to him peacefully. He's peaceful with them. He says that he will surrender peacefully to the US military. He's not going to go with a fight. So essentially, they don't feel threatened at that point. They feel that the threat is over. He then gets arrested, and the next day he calls his father and actually says to his father, I'm really sorry that I couldn't be stronger, which is so sad because that is what he had said to his father when he was talking to him about the breakdown of the relationship. His advice as a dad was to say to his son, be strong. And obviously on reflection, looking at his actions, Stephen Schap realises, well, I wasn't strong. What I did was a terrible thing. So, like I said, he goes down without any fight. He accepts that he's going to be arrested. It's clear from the very get-go that Schap's the perpetrator of the crime. There's multiple witnesses, and also he just confesses. And there's a problem in the fact that when we think about a crime of passion, we do not believe in premeditation. So we do not believe that it's ever right to kill. We all know that. But there are certain situations and scenarios where people lose their minds for moments. It's still inexcusable that that plays out, but there is an understanding beneath their actions that means their intent is less than it would be considered in murder. So when you have a crime of passion, if you suddenly act in a way where you punch somebody and that person hits the ground and dies because you found that they were having sex with your wife, you will still get charged with an offence, and rightly so, but you're not going to be looking at murder in the first degree because it was completely out of character. You acted in the heat of the moment and nobody would have anticipated that would have ever played out had that individual not done A, B or C to you. This doesn't excuse it. It just gives us an understanding there's no premeditation. But the problem you have in this case is those comments that Schap made to his wife, because she said to the police that when he was with her, he was saying that he'd planned for it. Also, he'd said to the doctors in the time that had passed between them being in the room and him getting arrested that he'd learned about how to disconnect a head from a body. So that suggests that he had actually been planning to kill. So then investigators, of course, are looking for evidence to indicate that he'd actually studied a preparation essentially for the killing. And they do actually find some books and some pamphlets in his quarters that they felt were relevant. So there was a pamphlet called Everybody's Knife Bible and Your Silent Partner. And there were also books about army life. There was also an army field manual. But I just want to be real for a minute. This guy's in the army. He has weapons. So having something called Everybody's Knife Bible or Your Silent Partner, and it's about books and army life, etc., that doesn't say, I'm going to learn how to cut somebody's head off. I'm planning an execution. I mean, that just sounds like things that you might have if you were in the army. I mean, my God, come the day that anyone was suspecting me of some kind of crime and they did search my house, they'd be like, Sorry, like, let's just get this sorted, right? Wheel her off now. Wheel her off. She's absolutely guilty. Why? Why is she guilty? I've been in the cupboards. She's got books on spells and incantations. She's got books about mysticism. She's got books about runes. She's got runes. She's got tarot. She's got lots of different theology books. She's got specific books related to a lot of serial killers. And she's got some really inappropriate books, such as The Last Meal Served to a Serial Killer and the ingredients required to make it. Without a shadow of a doubt, this woman is guilty of being a Satanist. She probably boils babies, does blood sacrifices on a Wednesday night, and is without doubt a serial killer. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, John, it's only shoplifting that we're actually investigating. We're just coming to check whether the booze that's apparently been stolen from the local Tesco is in her residence. I think you're maybe taking it a little bit too far. We arrest her. We figure out all of the unsolved murders in the local area. We charge her with every single one of them, even the ones where she's actually too young to have ever done. Just throw them all in. It's all going to be fine. I'm telling you, just go with me on this. All I'm saying is, by the way, I haven't shoplifted alcohol from the local Tesco, just putting it out there. What I'm saying is, we all know, don't we, that we all have certain books. It doesn't indicate that we literally are guilty. Also, right, put yourself in his context. He's just done something completely out of character. It's wildly out of character. He's cut somebody's head off. He's then in a situation where he wants to hurt this woman as much as possible because she has hurt him in his mind. It's completely inexcusable what he's done. But in his head, psychologically, she has caused this. She did not need to have sex with his friend. She did not need to get pregnant by his friend. She is, as far as he's concerned, love's executioner. So now he is going to further harm her and scare her by saying, I planned this. You know, he becomes the ultimate devil god in this moment, and she becomes the ultimate victim in this moment. He takes the power back by saying, I am everything you should fear. And indeed, I'm proving that I am everything you should fear, because if you look, that head is there because of what I've done. So like I'm noting, I don't think that those books genuinely indicate that he was premeditating this killing. Also, I don't think him saying what he said in the heat of the moment to her indicates that he was planning this killing. But it is going to be enough for the actual prosecution to suggest that that's the case. So because Schap committed the murder, and we know that as a definite fact, and because those books are loosely connected to knives, and because he made those comments, maybe as throwaway as they might have been, that meant that the prosecution can look at it being premeditated, which is a whole different ballgame when it comes down to sentencing. So the investigators are gathering all this information together, and obviously that's with an intention to say that he had planned the killing and therefore it was murder as opposed to manslaughter. Schap is court-martialed, and then in March of 1994, the actual trial begins. And Schap pleads guilty at this point to voluntary manslaughter. Now, that means that he carried out the killing whilst in the heat of sudden passion caused by adequate provocation. And that's what you need to prove to a jury in this situation, that you had done it in the heat of a sudden passion caused by adequate provocation. So you can look and go, I understand why, whilst it's completely inexcusable, whilst it's completely unfair that he did this, there is an understanding as to why. Now, during the case, Schap said that he felt physically incapacitated, he felt outside of himself during the murder. He said that Gregory no longer seemed like Greg. He said he didn't even feel that he was present as a human being. He also did genuinely apologise to Gregory's family. He said, I am sorry, I am the man responsible, and that he also knew what it was like to lose a loved one. Diane came and gave evidence. She testified that their marriage had been experiencing issues. That was even before the move to Germany. She said that she just had a problem communicating with him. They just didn't seem to communicate effectively. She was telling him what the issues were. She was saying the problems that she was having, but he just wasn't receptive and that he didn't discuss his feelings. She said that she always felt like she'd been rebuffed, so she was never acknowledged, and it was upsetting for her. So when Schap had gone away on the work trip, her friendship with Gregory, because she felt lonely, had developed into this sexual relationship. She became pregnant. She then had to tell Gregory that she was pregnant, and he was actually really good. He was really excited. he really wanted to be involved, that he even started to discuss plans to move and to get married. So she was all in where Gregory was concerned. Diane also testified in court about the horror and the trauma that she'd endured when her husband had walked into her hospital room and then got Gregory's head out and forced her to look at it. Like, she couldn't compute that that was real. She was pregnant with this man's baby and she was staring at his severed head. And that pregnancy was successful. So I don't have any information, but I do know that at the court case, she was very obviously pregnant. So it means that the very thing that she wanted desperately, to have a child, that was something she was gifted. But she was gifted that baby at a cost to Gregory's life, and that's not her fault at all. But there's just such a cruel irony that she gets to have a baby, but she just doesn't get to have the love story that she so obviously craved. Schap's mother, she also spoke in court. She said he would have done anything to keep his family together and that he viewed the marriage for life. So again, what we're seeing ultimately is that rigid psychology that Stephen Schap holds, which is, this is how it has to be. This is how my life has to play out. And of course, inevitably, it wasn't playing out that way. So he did the ultimate crime to remove the person that was causing him the issue, which was Gregory in this case, without realizing that that would make no difference whatsoever to his wife's feelings and ultimately mean that none of them could have a life full of love, full of hope, because it was destroyed by his actions. The two doctors who spoke to Schap after he'd returned with Gregory's head, they also testified in court. They said that Schap said to them, listen to everything I have to say, remember as much as you can. And one of the doctors recounted about how scared he'd been when he was in the proximity of Schap, because that's understandably just horrifically killed someone. They didn't know what his state of mind was. But that doctor said it became really clear that he just wanted to talk about why he'd committed the murder. And once he'd realised that Schap just needed to get that off his chest, he didn't feel threatened. They said that in anatomical terms, the head had been disconnected in a very adequate way, which is weird because, just going to throw it out there, I'm not somebody who's schooled in this, but is it really going to make sense that the doctors were looking at that head and thinking, yeah, they've done a good job. I'm a bit worried about those doctors if that's it. If those two doctors thought that a man who had hacked somebody's head off and then kicked the rest of it off had done a good job of removing it, they should not be allowed within 100 meters of a scalpel or a patient or an operating theatre. I don't get that. And also the pathologist disagreed with that. But this is what they're saying. I just imagine it's because the head had been placed on the side and therefore they couldn't see the damage to the actual flesh beneath it. That's the way I'm thinking of it anyway. Now, prosecutor Captain Jennifer Beeks, she said, when a mother sends a child off to the army, she knows he may come back in a body bag. She does not expect her child to come back slaughtered in 2 pieces at the hands of a fellow soldier. In closing arguments, Captain Mike Mulligan called the slaying a cold, calculated act of revenge by a hunter who skillfully tracked down his wife's lover. I'm not going to say that that isn't a great closing argument, by the way. I think it's very effective at drawing a very emotional reaction from a jury, but I just want to say that he didn't need to track down Gregory. He knew where he was. It was very easy to find him. He literally worked on the same base. The idea that there was some kind of predatory hunting down indicates somebody who's stalking, who's taking time, who's really calculated. That's not what happened. He found out that the affair had occurred and that his wife was pregnant, and then he went and killed the man who was having an affair with her. Ultimately, the only thing that had shifted between the time that he'd seen Gregory last and when he killed Gregory was the experience of realizing he'd been betrayed. That's the trigger. Painting him as this cold, calculating, premeditated murderer, it just doesn't fit with the evidence. It really doesn't. No matter what Schap says to his wife in that room, it doesn't fit with the evidence in my mind. But that's how he's painted. And essentially it's telling the jury this guy knew what he was doing, did it in a very cold, calculating way, and it came from a deep level of premeditation, not an acting out of character in a crime of passion. Now, David Court, who was Schap's civilian attorney, he called the killing an act of sudden passion triggered by a friend's betrayal. We get to the 1st of April 1994. Schap's 26 years old at this time. He was found guilty of premeditated murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. Now, 6 of the 7 jurors actually, in spite of this, signed a statement advising that he be shown mercy. 5 believing that the maximum sentence should be 30 years and 1 believing it should be 20 years. So his sentence was reduced to 45 years. Now, as we would all expect, Schap appealed his sentence, but the decision of the United States Army Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed that it was the correct sentence. Some of you might think he should have been for life. At the end of the day, he cut some innocent man's head off. Some of you may feel, no, this was manslaughter. This was a case of somebody losing their mind in the heat of the moment. It wasn't premeditated and he didn't deserve as long as 40 odd years. That said, he could walk the streets again and be free, and that means that he has a chance and a hope of life outside the prison, which is something that unfortunately Gregory was never granted. Gregory was murdered horribly, and let's be honest, his wife, so Diane in this case, she was the one having the affair and she gets to live. So it seems deeply unfair that Gregory becomes the victim in this situation. Now, it's estimated that between 20 and 25% of married men are unfaithful, and between 10 and 15% of women have affairs when married. So it is relatively common, unfortunately, that these things happen. And I guess that until you experience that kind of betrayal, you can't predict how you'll react. You can't understand it unless you've been there. It is something I've been through, and it is deeply devastating. And it is infuriating and rage-provoking, and it is sad. But the idea that you would go through those feelings and then kill somebody because of it, understandably, that's far less common. It's very rare. Having said that, and this is unbelievable, guys, in the UK, killing a wife due to infidelity was considered to be a classic provocation for murder before 2009. You heard me right. Classic. I've killed my wife. Why? She was sleeping with somebody else. Whoa. She probably deserves to be murdered. I know. I mean, is that not just a classic reason to murder her? It is. I think you'll find, even legally, it's a classic provocation. She's basically asking for it. She was asking for you to kill her. I'm not sure she was. But what I'm saying is, I did. And I'm going to use that as my defence. At the end of the day, it was a classic provocation. If she hadn't done A, I wouldn't have done B, and therefore we wouldn't be here now at sea, would we? But yeah, just go and kill a woman. It's fine. She deserved it, didn't she? Now, fortunately, because, I don't know, we're a bit more schooled in sense, it's now not seen as a defensible reason to lose control and to resort to killing. Now, bear in mind as well, when we're looking at this case, the marriage was actually over when he found out about the pregnancy. I do fully understand that he'd still be angry because he'd had a vasectomy. He'd had a vasectomy at a very young age for Diane. So he did completely trust her. He thought he was going to be with her for the rest of her life. It must have been a nightmare finding out that wasn't the case. He may well have regretted that decision as well when his marriage fell apart. He can't have kids. That would mean he would be less attractive to prospective partners. And then there she is, pregnant with Gregory's child. So that rage, that depth of betrayal is just a whole other level. And then he realises as well that his friend was the person cheating on him. That again just embeds that betrayal and humiliation, particularly when you know that everyone's going to find out where you work. It would be deeply upsetting, and that could well have just pushed him over the edge. I mean, it does seem wildly out of character for who he is as a person in the past and how he's been described by everybody who knows him. And like I said, it is interesting, isn't it, that the majority of his anger is directed towards Gregory rather than towards his wife. Maybe that's because he wants to show Diane that he's superior out of them, that he can take this man who essentially is somebody who thinks that he can steal his wife and put him back in his place. Maybe it's more to do with the fact that he loves Diane and he can't harm Diane. Maybe it's because, hey, their relationship had problems. Therefore, he can understand why she may have strayed. But his relationship with Gregory, well, that was pure, that was good. He'd done nothing wrong to Gregory. So maybe the betrayal of Gregory is harder to swallow because they had a good friendship. Why would he want to hurt him in such a way? So inevitably, he's been hurt emotionally by his friend. Now he'll hurt his friend physically, fatally, because of those actions. So yes, it could have been a level of competition amongst the males, but it could just have been the sense of absolute betrayal by somebody that he had never put a foot wrong with. Like I said, he understands that his relationship with Diane isn't perfect, but his relationship with Gregory, it seemed to be really good. So that could have been the thing that essentially lit the fire. And I suppose finally he could have just done it to get back at Diane, to kill Gregory as a means of punishing her, so that she feels culpable, she feels responsible, and she's denied a future that she wanted with another man, and she'll become a single parent to that man's child without his support. So that could also be an act of vengeance. I still stand by some of my own feelings in this case, which is that he suppressed all of his feelings, swallowed them down so hard for so long that inevitably they erupted. And it's inexcusable, but it lends us insight as to how somebody who'd never ever been anything but a good guy can eventually lose their shit entirely and do something so grotesque, so horrific, and so fatal when we consider this case. One of the things about Stephen Schap is that he was ultimately a very bright person. He's the 98th percentile of intelligence. They did an intelligence test that was performed at Walter Reed Army Medical Center after the murder. He is somebody who is unbelievably intelligent. But the problem with people who are very, very, very bright is that sometimes they overanalyze everything to a position where there is no feeling attached. They put things neatly in boxes. They want to logically make sense of things. And ultimately, life's messy. You don't get to do that all the time. And if all you've ever done is compartmentalize every feeling and you've never really processed them, then in the end, you can get this build-up of pressure and stress and anxiety and suppression that just explode and implode and change not only your world, but the world of those around you. In this case, Diane, and in this case, Gregory, and all who knew and loved them. Now, as I've said, from what I can figure, Diane did have Gregory's baby. She was apparently pregnant at the murder trial. I don't know whether Stephen Schap has been released yet, because there has been some sources that said he was released in 2017, but I cannot actually definitively say that this is true. If he hasn't been released, he's currently serving his time at Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. So a really horrible case, because this is a case that should never have happened. When you actually consider who Stephen Schap was, who Diane was, who Gregory was, their worlds should never have collided in such a murderous way. And if it tells us anything, it tells us that when we feel something at origin, we should express and deal with it at origin, because there is a possibility for those who just refuse to do that, refuse to deal with those messy, challenging human feelings, they can build up and do something disastrous if they're not dealt with appropriately, either harming the self or indeed in this case, harming an innocent party. Do you think he should have been done for murder, or are you more on the fence as to whether this really was manslaughter? I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below, and as ever guys, I'll see you next time.